Welcome everyone. Are you ready? So most probably it's going to not be the most exciting, most animated session, especially for developers, because it's meant to be a project manager one. Also raising some security awareness for devs, PMs, business owners, and all kind of people. So I'm trying to make some, fun, trying to be a little bit less strict than usually I am, and I hope you will enjoy it. So it's called A Bug's Life. Everyone knows the cartoon from the late 90s that was done by Pixar. Anyone? Okay, great. If you are still digesting the lunch, just feel free to even snore, that's fine. So it's going to be A Bug's Life about Drupal security, application security, and vulnerability management. Super nice topics. Let me introduce myself a little bit. I use the middle name, so Balazs. Yeah, I don't know how this works. I'm working with Drupal since 2007, and currently I take all of these nice positions. One of the most important in this regards is being a provisional member in the Drupal Security Team and also leading some European Commission security-related activities, especially for Drupal and open source technologies. And there is my picture. So, A Bug's Life, when we talk about bugs, especially in IT, we shouldn't go further than just calling all of the issues that we discover or others discover bugs. Even if it's a programming bug, like let's say an issue, something malfunctions, something doesn't go that well, or it's a security one. It's very important to understand all the issues that we discover can be the one that brings us further. We have to learn out of it. There are many programs all over the world, especially in large organizations, that we call security awareness programs. First of all, the main point of all of these is to educate employees of large firms to be more secure, not necessarily in IT or in programming techniques, but for instance, changing passwords regularly, being up to date with current threats, and so on and so forth. What is very important to understand are the company security policies. So all employees and all people who deliver something to the given firm, it's important to be up to date. If something happens, something is changed in the policies, we all have to be aware, right? In enterprise level, the whole story starts with a top-down approach. So usually there has to be either a CIO or either someone from a high management who introduces either the changes or introduces security awareness programs and saying, we want to get these things together, being on a policy way, defined, having a governance, and so on and so forth again. What is important here is to understand what are the key assets in a company. So let's say key assets can be the computers running, for instance, Windows 10, or key asset can be the servers that has to be protected by DevOps colleagues or by a dedicated security incident team. And also, big companies have to always and regularly and iteratively invest in security measures and different technologies. What is good for us, for instance, being in a smaller company, we also can benefit. What is important, again, a little bit top to down, is to understand how news can be shared with your coworkers. So, for instance, something happens in the big news related to security, we have to update different software products, such as in Drupal. Tonight, something might come out. Something with a high risk might come out. I'm not saying anything, just, it's Wednesday. If it happens, Either it needs an immediate action or can be postponed and later on resolved, or at least in the meantime mitigated. What it means, all the people working for you or with you have to be aware of that. That's what we call security awareness program. On a small level, you basically can have one person in your firm that says and that announces all of these informations. Either it's a security threat or a given vulnerability, or even manages all these activities to update them. Now I turned off the whole screen. Great. How I turn it? Oh, awesome. So, what I just said in the very beginning, let's recap already. Security issues are bugs with different severity and business impact. So there might be a vulnerability disclosed tonight, for instance, which doesn't necessarily impact your business, or vice versa. Having a relatively small bug introduced tonight that might cause a very big impact for your business. There is an example. For instance, one of the latest Drupal core issue that we got a few months ago was a third-party update. You should have evaluated that risk, saying, do we rely on that particular third-party library, or we just don't use it? Regardless of it is present in your services or not, you always have to understand what is the real threat. Let's go a little bit further. So just summarizing, the whole bugs is not about putting the blame on anyone. If there is a colleague, you can use git blame, of course. If that colleague introduced that security bug in your system, so in a custom code base, right? Forget that part. You don't have to point the fingers on that person. Let me go way further. You don't have to fire him or her. The importance here is to understand and learn out of the issues and not cause it again. There might be authentication ones, authorization ones, data confidentiality or integrity issues. Those are the classically big groups of security bugs. But keep it in your mind, we all can, and I would say must, learn out of these. So I said a bug's life. What is a bug's life? It has 4 different stages. And we are going to cover all the 4 different stages to see how a software product, especially a Drupal one, can be planned, can be implemented, and later on maintained. So let's start with the eggs. Planning and security by design. How you can plan classically in a project management phrase or position a software product. You have to keep in mind some budgeting issues, you have to have the correct resources, people working for the project, knowing the client needs, especially if you are in an agency. There are many, many things. Now we focus on none of them except security, which is the topic today. Basically, it's always the same. How your people learn new stuff, learning, I don't know, React, if you are just introducing it, they spend the time to learn it, and also iteratively to learn it. So from one day to another, obviously no one will be expert of a technology, right? No one will be expert of security as well. Let them learn, teach them, educate them, ask them what they are afraid of. Ask them what they have reported, what was reported about them, if we think about bigger firms. And letting them deep dive into topics, of course, in certain time frames. If we go a little bit further and take a look in the industrial standards, there is one very good example from the early 2000s saying The Thinking Evil by Andrew van der Stok. He introduced 3 questions, and we are going to check them all. So the first question is, thinking evil, try to think evil, is this one. Is the process surrounding this feature as safe as possible? In other words, is this a flawed process? When you plan a functionality, it's important to know what could go wrong. understanding from a PM perspective, it's not necessarily something that you want to introduce in your project, right? Saying, okay, we are asking different data from end users, so like form items. Then you have to think about how those form items can be exploited. That's all about. The second one is, if I were evil, how would I abuse this feature? Again, the example with the form, if I am evil and I want to cause something bad to the project or bad to the customer, will I introduce something as like intercepting a process or attacking the network, for instance? You have to keep in mind, network is not necessarily part of the application because of different layers. So always try to think how it can be abused. That's the message here. And the third one is the feature required to be on by default? If so, are there limits or options that could help reduce the risk from this feature? What is it about? It's basically all default values could introduce any flaws. So 0, null, and let's take these. 0 and null are different in PHP. Will be there some exceptions even thrown on the screen by the application if the application gets the default value? Will it throw some information about the system itself? You have to protect the application itself to not throw random errors or not throw too many issues. By default, values have to be as safe as possible. So, here are a few issues that we have to learn out of. And I don't see the screen. So, the principles here are basically first and second parties. So, forget all the third-party dependencies that we heard by Jess in the morning, but focus on these ones. For instance, fail securely. What I just mentioned before, if there is an exception thrown by your application, you have to handle all the information that you show on the front end as secure as possible. Do not just throw, you are using still PHP 5.6, because there might be some issues with it, especially if you introduce the patch level. You don't want to let them know. Also, establish the secure defaults, or even the least privilege, which is a fairly known issue. If you give too many permissions to one of the less privileged user role, for instance, giving full HTML filter format to be used by Anonymous, something will go wrong, I promise. Not the best idea. So give as least privileges to the less trusted users. That's all about. If we think about third-party, such as dependencies, the general recommendation is to never trust them. There was a very good point by Jess in the morning saying, lock all the versions. You might think about it's not the best practice, because otherwise why we have all those nice techniques in Composer, for instance, to just to get the latest one. You cannot trust a third party. You don't know who is developing that. You don't know what is the plan with that third party. Maybe it will be removed one day and your whole entire application will be just disappearing or malfunctioning, right? So always try to think twice. I would also focus on the very last one. Fix the security issues correctly. What it means, if you find the flaw in your code base, such as all the database queries are used with DB query, okay? Especially in Drupal 8 where it's already deprecated. If you find it once in your code base, check the whole entire code base. Is it introduced or used anywhere else? And then you are basically doing it well, reducing the risk globally. So fix issues, all of them correctly. That was all about security by design, and that was all about the planning. When there are the plans, what happens next? Implementation, which is obviously an iterative one if we are in Agile, or we just let all the developers be in a cage for years and we follow the great waterfall. another version. So I'm going to focus mainly on the first release and the iteration until we get there in the caterpillar phrase. So here is one sentence. I just let all of you read it. What could be the most important word, a part of security and software? Okay, in this sentence, who is the actor? Anyone? Okay, the actor here is the stakeholder. So we have to know what the stakeholder, business owner, whomever needs higher security in the software project, or just, puts there the money, what they have to be aware of. Their knowledge about all of these things that we talk about is very key to improve security. This is all about it. The basic skills, when we try to understand what we can give to these stakeholders, are just written there. One of the most important is to protect all of these disclosures, all of the disruptions. Imagine one case, you are reporting something to the Drupal security team. This information is yours. Do not tell it anyone. Follow the same disclosure policy just like all the members and provisional members and basically everyone do. Even it happens in a contributed module or happens in your custom-based one, yeah? The thing is, if you don't share these informations with others, you limit the possibility of a 0 day. 0 day is never a good idea. We are in Drupal, let me remind all of you, we never had any 0 days, thanks to all of you. Because you, even not being aware of, you are following the disclosure policy, so thanks. There are 3 slides now, which are focusing on different layers, different levels of security. And all of them comes from a big book where these principles are one by one explained. I highly recommend it. I'm going to share the slides with lots of links after the session, hopefully tonight. By the way, tonight, board games, going to be awesome. So these are the things that you have to do to protect your application, such as sanitizing all of the inputs. It's quite easy and straightforward in Drupal 7, 8, also the 9 will be the same, more or less. What I would highlight here is the last 2. Make sure third-party libraries are secured. So tonight, do not drink too many alcohol if something comes out. And the very last one, to set strong password policies. Anyone can give you an example in Drupal 7 or 8, regardless, for a contrib module that makes these policies editable from a user interface, for instance. Anyone? It has a fairly straightforward name, password policies, or policy. Use that module. I mean, it can bring you so many nice nights when users will be just logged out, kicked out, and they will have to change their password. Okay, we all know the classic users just use like admin, or use like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, whatever. Those are not that secure, right? Using this module basically just blocks these users using easy passwords. They can use whatever that is publicly not pawned. It's a very good module. And some contribution might happen on the module to finally bring it to a stable release in Drupal 8. So please join us. And I again turn it off. Great. So one layer below, we go to infrastructure. How we can keep web security on the infrastructure level is basically setting up, for instance, HTTPS for domain entries. Sometimes it's not the easiest, especially if you have multi-site with many different entry points. Still trying and still iteratively introducing that functionality or that protection to your infrastructure might bring higher security measures. Also using TLS and not SSL. It's quite obvious for all of us, but there are still people out there who has to know about these. That's why I'm spending the time to tell you all of these security principles. And yeah, basically hiding web info and listing directories. I mean, we are not in the 90s anymore, right? To just throw the root folder, web root folder to the front end, and the user might choose which website he wants. No, there are way better techniques. Do not show anything about your servers. And the third one is basically protecting your users. They are below everything. At least you can control the application. At least you can, or your DevOps colleagues or sysadmins can control the server. But no one can control the users. They might click all around, right? They might do something crazy. Limit their possibilities. Do not allow too many things, such as the response headers. You have to keep in your mind they might send you different headers, not just, such as put headers. If you remember last year when we got an issue, a Drupal core issue, it was using not the standard headers, but not the classically known get and post headers. But there was a way to exploit websites via put and patch headers. Those are techniques that not the average user, obviously, will do, but attackers might try. We turn to the third and one of the shortest phrase, which is called, I'm not a native English, as you might have realized, Chrysalis, kind of. When we go to the very first release or the first releases of the application. Let's see what we have to do there. So, one of the nicest, vulnerability assessment. So, here we talk about just assessing the vulnerabilities, saying the scanning happens on the application level. So, if there are publicly known vulnerabilities, these scanner programs or these activities, the VAs, will discover them. The thing is, here you need, or especially if you are a bigger organization, you need an asset manager that collects all your assets, such as websites. You have hundreds of websites. You have to know which version, for instance, of a contrib module is present there. For instance, there is I don't think that much known, but a very good German product called Dropguard that basically, for free, do monitoring activities. Not the fastest for the free, but at least something. And you see all your modules connected from different GitHub repos or Git repos, and you see what are the versions. That's an asset manager. You have to keep all the versions, especially if you don't lock the version numbers in Composer, for instance. Those might be just updated out of blue. Just Composer update happens and boom, something might have happened. If you remember, there was like 2 months kind of ago when Twig got updated. Then we were lost because it broke things. And many folks started to work overnight to fix that and release a new Drupal version just because Twig totally broke everything. A very long discussion happened on Slack and also on the issue queue. It was almost a disaster. That's why we need, for instance, Drupal Security Team. That's why we need all of you having different backgrounds to keep everything up to date. Contribution, right? If we go one step further, there are the security assessments. So it's basically what we talked about, vulnerability one, plus these things, such as doing authorized access, authorized testing from their seat, attacking the application. So those are, for instance, tools that we know burp, that scans the application, finds out different path, and tries to, inject their things, or try to exploit somehow else the applications. Those are tools that are usually for a license fee you can use. Burp also licensed. Fortify, RIPS, assessment tools, those are very heavy ones. What you always have to keep in mind why that industry needs us, security analysts, is to sort these issues out. We call them false positives. Imagine a case when there is just purely thrown out a raw in a twig file, a raw value of something in a twig file. Blindly, if you say there is vulnerability, you might cause business disruption saying that should not be used there. If there is a raw, there are many other ways, not in the twig template, but in module files or in different classes, to way before it goes to the twig template to sanitize it. So raw doesn't mean necessarily it's vulnerable. Could have been sanitized differently. Yeah, also examining logs and system responses, error messages, code, all of these happen in a security assessment. Penetration tests, those are the craziest ones. Anyone heard about it? Ooh, great. So penetration test is basically super automated, not the one when we analysts are there, just go crazy. Usually on penetration test, not necessarily the application, it's also, but not necessarily the application is scanned or tried to be exploited, most likely the infrastructure. So going crazy with the plugs, with the ports, scanning ports from server sides, seeing classically known vulnerabilities. Can they be exploited on different UTP ports, for instance? And when we go to a security audit, it's basically everything. So it's driven by a risk function to look at specific compliance issues. You have to understand when you create an industry-known security audit, it wants to cover everything. Vulnerability assessment, security assessment, and pen test. It goes crazy. Everything that can be scanned from a security perspective on an application introducing flaws in the infrastructure level, then it will be hopefully covered by a security audit. But there is one more thing, which is not anymore a ladybug, but an ugly whatever bug, which is the security review. So when you ask, for instance, a company to do a security audit, you might get an offer for like 5-6 digits, because it's a big one. But when you ask a security review, you might get an offer for a way cheaper things. But keep in your mind, that's meant to be for something else. For instance, a gap analysis, how the thing is designed, how the documentation is written, how securely it is up to date. For instance, a review will just give you all the third-party components that you have, not necessarily from Drupal, but from real third-party or even fourth-party vendors, how they are keeping up to date their activities. A review is about that. It's not an audit. And we turn to the last phrase now, the butterfly. I'm just checking the time, which I didn't start on my screen. Great. So the butterfly is basically when you already released everything and you turn to the maintenance phase. Just let me see some hands who work for an agency type of company. Just raise your hands. Okay, great. How many of these agencies, and the rest of the people also can vote, do maintenance activities? Wow, that's great. You do a great job. Let me tell you how it could be even better. So there are 3 pillars of information security. The first is the confidentiality. Confidentiality means only allow access to data for which the user is permitted. So if the user shouldn't see something, then do not allow to see that something, okay? Pretty straightforward, confidentiality. The second one is integrity, which means you have to make the data protected and not tampered or altered by unauthorized user. There might be a data, such as a name, which can be changed by an administrator. That is totally fine, but not by a webmaster, right? That's why we in Drupal have different user roles. Keep it in your mind, integrity is all about that. Availability, though, is a little bit broader scope. In application layer, usually we don't meet availability issues, even though it's one of the pillars. But ensuring the system and data and their availability, so they are available to authorized users in the time when they need it. It sounds like something that the DevOps should take care of, right? Not always. But when we talk about maintenance and maintenance activities, one of them is basically to scan, for instance, for us Drupal dudes, the Wednesdays. When you get an advisory, basically it follows a certain path that we call vulnerability management. It covers different evaluations of the issue based on different perspectives, such as the pillars or such as other activities and other possibilities. What is important here to understand regarding vulnerability management is there are cases when you are just basically not able to upgrade your software. The whole Drupal community suffers by third-party upgrades because those are obviously not depending on us, such as Symfony update. We have to update the whole entire Drupal 8 to be compliant with the newest Symfony things, like major ones, because backward compatibility, so we are more or less covered. But still, for the big one, major releases, we are just lost. Those cases, especially when there are introduced vulnerabilities, so known vulnerabilities might cause disruptions. What it means, you have to step up and you have to mitigate the risk. Mitigation means lowering the risk. Imagine a case. We get a security advisory by the Drupal Security Team tonight. Just imagine, I'm not saying anything, it will, who knows, which says the issue can be exploited by Anonymous. What could be a possible mitigation? To not allow that functionality to Anonymous. So for instance, I'm giving you a stupid idea, path auto settings can be done by authenticated users. Do not, okay? Do not. The issue is with path auto and allowing, based on that permission, to be exploited by authenticated users. What you do, you go crazy because you are just not able to update. That's the remediation. But you are able to mitigate the risk. So you remove that permission from the authenticated users, and for a while you are good. Please, do not stop at mitigation. It's a good way to temporarily resolve everything. But imagine next week you get again something with path auto, which might not be able to be mitigated because of no permission is needed or already something more deeper, and you will be kind of asked to update. So mitigation, temporary is good, go for remediation. The trusted source are a crazy topic. How will you know the advisory that is announced, or any kind of advisories that are announced, are just fine? They come from the source where it's okay. So Drupal Security Team is obviously a trusted source. We know who are there, we can follow them. There is for instance, a Twitter account where all of this happens. There is in Drupal Slack the channel where they also inform us, and there are many, many other channels that they use to keep us updated. But for instance, if something happens on GitHub with a third-party tool where there is no dedicated Drupal security, there is no dedicated security team, how you can rely on the information that you get? They might try to access your data just by advising something, such as update this fork of a repository that might introduce something. So always keep in your mind, trusted sources should be trusted by third parties, such as two libraries that we have, the National Vulnerability Database and the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. All of the issues that are serious ones are reported first there. In Drupal, we have the private issue queue, security.drupal.org. If you find something in the contrib, please report it first there, because they are authorized for it, okay? If the issue meets certain high severity, it will be also represented as a CVE. Basically, NVD and CVE are more or less the same, slightly different, and the countries are different that runs them. But hey, we have the Drupal vulnerability management. Do you remember, or do you know, whenever there is on a Wednesday evening an issue coming out, there are those code things, like no one really wants to, like, you know, letter by letter read them over, but we are going to check the 6 categories now. What do they mean? A tale behind the codes. So who and how? The first two, if you have the codes, the first and the second represents who and how complex is the exploit way, the path, to do something wrong. The first, access complexity, can be non-basic or complex, meaning if the access complexity is none, it's a high risk. If it's complex, such as the attacker has to follow a certain path, click here, do there, something, intercept something in the network, those are usually complex. So it's not just something that you might do in half a minute. It's also important for the complex ones, those are usually way more difficult to be scripted. So usually the complex ones don't represent such a high risk because of going to exploits. Quite hard to write automated scripts to exploit them widely. The authentication, though, has non-user and admin values. Again, what it means, if there is no authentication protection on the module or on that specific activities or functionality, then it's quite easy to exploit. If the user needs to be an admin role or just a highly trusted user role, then it might be way more difficult to do something nasty. We talked about the pillars before in information security. Here we come. So Drupal vulnerability management basically follows the standards, saying confidentiality and integrity. Not spending too much time, both of them can be all, so integrity can be totally ruined by an exploit, or can be some data might be leaked in the confidentiality, or can be none. For instance, usually XSS issues are either some or none, because neither confidentiality nor integrity is affected. But for instance, remote code execution, which is one of the highest threat, usually affects both of them, saying all, so integrity of the application and the confidentiality of data is highly expected to be disrupted. But we were talking about 3 pillars. Currently, availability pillar of information security is not covered by the Drupal security team and the advisories. The reason why is basically the CVSS scoring system, which we are relying on, which also doesn't highly follow the classic standards, so information security standards, but saying availability should be always handled out of the application layer. So that's one of the reasons why we don't evaluate availability on a publicly known vulnerability in case of Drupal. So no availability. Maybe it will be once introduced, who knows. But here is the conditions of the surface, which are the fifth and the sixth points that we get. Usually when there is a new vulnerability introduced, all the values of the different ones are set and will never change because we know the details, right? Except the exploit, number 5. Because in the very beginning, it's usually if there is no information leaked or there is no third party who already introduced that flaw or having no information anywhere out of the people who are trusted, who know what is the issue, we just end up saying theoretical. If something goes out, such as a proof of concept, a written document saying do this, do that, and then you get access to a resource, for instance, then we go up. And that's when an advisory can be changed. Even the risk can go above the originally announced ones. And if there are publicly known bots, for instance, that attacks sites, such as in 2014 we had the SQL injection issue in Drupal 7 core, then exploits are available and the value will be set or updated to exploit. The very last one, the target distribution, is a tricky one. Usually people don't necessarily understand what is it about. Basically, the target distribution says the module or theme or library, whatever, how is it configured. If nothing has to be changed, nothing has to be customized, so all the settings that are shipped by default with the component, then we end up saying all target distributions are affected by the flaw, by the vulnerability. If there are some which are shipped, no, sorry, I was talking about the default. If you change anything, so the previous one was the default, the middle. If there are changes, you customize the component, how it works, and you use not that classically known or common ones, making sense settings, then you end up the lowest risk uncommon. But if, regardless of how you set up the module, it will be still vulnerable, then you end up with the highest risk because you can't do some mitigations, remember? Then we are on the all. What is important, out of the 6 categories, Drupal Security Team sets a risk level, which I don't have a slide anyway. Out of the 25 points, that is basically just a simple mathematical summary of all the 6 categories, differently numbered. We can say it's high or medium, highly critical, critical, moderately critical, low critical, or something like that, or non-critical. Usually the non-criticals you will almost never meet because mathematically it's just kind of not possible to arrive there. So whatever, almost whatever is announced will be some sort of severity out of the 4 top ones. If you arrive with the vulnerability to a highly critical one, I would always suggest to evaluate as fast as you can, because there might be cases when settings are, for instance, uncommon, but everything else is on the top, so the summary is highly critical. Or exploit is available, but the whole mathematical method only brings up moderately critical. So my general suggestion here is when you get the advisory, never just rely blindly on saying, oh, it's moderately, I don't care. Check at least 2 things. The authentication, who can access, or who has to be the user to attack your application, and the exploit. If both of them are enough low, you are usually fine. usually. That's all about the slides. I'd like to introduce one more thing, which is a conference that I'm organizing with a few other security experts in Sofia, end of October. It's basically the weekend before DrupalCon Amsterdam, where I really hope we'll see you all. But Sofia is a little bit closer, right? Currently, call for sessions and sponsors are widely open, so please, if you want to give some money or like want to give a talk during the 2 days conference, catch me on the hallway or just during, you know, some social events. Talk to me what you are gonna submit, and we might, you know, fit somewhere. That's all, kind of. Any questions at this stage? Do you get some air? When I was watching some sessions, I was always falling asleep, but I saw your eyes were kind of okay. So you might got some air. Okay, no one wants to talk to me. Great. Thank you, and see you around.